Thank you very much. Let's see. I'm very pleased to be here. So this is a very different venue than last year. It was an interesting event. In fact, since that time, we at Sirius Decisions have spent quite a bit more time with our friends at Acrolinx, and we see some really interesting synergies. So first of all, how many of you know who Sirius Decisions is? Can I just get a sense? Because that will help me. Okay, all right, that's kind of what I expected. So we're an analyst firm, but very different from the typical sort of tech analyst firms in that we focus on marketing, product, sales. And what we focus on is process. So helping people figure out how to get things done. So we put together models and frameworks that basically give folks a head start so they don't have to figure it out on their own. And by the way, none of us really learn this stuff in college, so an approach is often needed, right? So I am in a service called Content Strategy and Operations. And while we do serve marketers, and I know that Acrolinx serves many departments, not just marketing, so I will be talking to you somewhat from the context of marketing, but I think you'll also see where, wow, it's really, you can kind of just go full circle here, where there's a lot of synergy regardless of what department you're in. So with that, actually, I need a clicker, don't I? All right. Oh. Okay, and you see Absolving Your Content Sins, the title. So this is actually a part of the presentation that I have for you today we gave at our own conference, which is called TechX last November. We've evolved it some since then, but as we got to thinking about what's the context for this whole conversation about governance, and at the time, what we were thinking about was really maintaining and attaining and maintaining content consistency. And it occurred to us that there's an awful lot of sinning going on around organizations. A lot of elephants in the room, if you will, with folks producing content sins, if you will, and just kind of setting them aside in terms of, yeah, I know I should fix this, but there isn't enough time. Anyway, as we started to think about that, somehow we came up with this idea of confessions. And anybody a fan of pet shaming? Love these. I got online and found, I looked up confessions, and I found a great one, which was Homer Simpson in a confession booth, but it turned out I couldn't use that. So then I came upon these, which I found hysterical. I must have spent an hour sitting and laughing at my computer. I have 2 cats, a dog, and a bird, so there's a lot of this going on in my house. No, he did it, really. Yes, it's a dead mouse, and I'm a 5-pound dog, but the cat did it. Okay. In any case, what occurs to us is there's really a lot of hidden confessions, if you will, in the B2B organization, really in all organizations. But just to qualify that, we specifically at Sirius Decisions serve B2B marketing organizations, quite usually, enterprise marketing orgs. So when we thought about this whole confessions piece, I want to make sure I'm going the right way. All right. It occurred to us also that there are a number of different types of sinners across the enterprise. So it kind of starts with this guy, the sly solo operator, who is bound and determined to do whatever he wants without regard for process, for messaging, none of that. He's got a job to do. So that's one. Then you've got your lack of change agent. And yes, I had some fun coming up with these. So your lack of change agent knows that she's changing something to core documents, and that those probably should be cascaded across many others. But that's really complicated, so I'm just going to focus on my own thing, right? Sound kind of familiar? Yeah. Okay, your brand barbarian. This is the sales guy that no matter how many times you send him the slide with a new logo, will not use it. I'm doing my own thing. Yeah. You guys have worked with a lot of the same people I have. All right, then you've got your technology tenderfoot. And this is the person who knows that there's a lot of features, there's a lot of ways to organize technology in such a way that will support some basic consistency, some governance. But you know what? She's got other things to worry about. So not really going to invest in what my current technology has or what I actually need. So that's just a little background. So we're going to talk today about the kind of sinning we see going on in organizations when it comes to content. So just to kind of cover the key issues. What we have seen in marketing, and honestly, really, this affects tech docs, the web, pretty much everywhere you look, there is this proliferation of content. And what we're seeing is, even in the smaller companies that we serve, everybody's trying to meet the needs of multiple audiences, many, many more channels than there were even a few years ago, right? And, you know, frankly, just more complexity when it comes to the kind of assets that folks expect to be able to see a lot more sophistication. So this proliferation has made it even more difficult to maintain content governance. And at the same time, it's made it ever more important. Because we are seeing that organizations realize that when there is a lack of governance, the brand is at risk, right? And because of that, we are seeing folks step up. Certainly, Acrolinks is a solution that serves this area. There's a lot of other process things folks need to do as well. But we are seeing this move up to being a more critically recognized part of what's happening. So in order to achieve this, one of the things we first tell our clients is, look, it can't just be all about one department, right? Document proliferation is across the organization. You've got stakeholders who are certainly your buyers and your customers, but there's others as well. And it really takes a cross-functional approach and a cross-functional plan and program that can be maintained to affect true content governance. So today, I'm going to show you some data that's interesting. In fact, this same week, started yesterday, is our Sirius Decisions Summit in Las Vegas. They think I'm there now. I'm really not. They think I'm hiding in my room. But anyway, here I am. I'm going there right after this. And we are introducing a new state of B2B survey data that we've literally just finished. There's some really interesting data in there. And as I was preparing for this, I thought to myself, you know what? A lot of this data, although the piece of data may be about something else, it functions as both a symptom and an indication of the impact of a lack of governance. So I'm excited to show you some of those. You'll be seeing them. We actually do that State of B2B session on Thursday, so you're getting a sneak peek. We're going to introduce, I'll talk to you about these steps that we've put together, really based on talking to organizations like yours. And we'll take a quick look at the way to architect technology when it comes to this area. So the first thing I want to do, just to sort of ground you in the way that we look at content, and I won't spend much time on this, but I did want to at least have it here. Is that my water? I think that one's, yeah, okay. Thank you very much. So this is what we call our priority architecture. So when we work with clients, we like to basically ground the conversation in a set of pillars that identify their priorities, which are at the same time the areas in which they have challenges. So these are the four: strategic content planning, and that's about ensuring that a rigorous, repeatable process is used to produce content that's going to meet the needs of the audience as well as be measurable, meet the needs of the organization. And then content management and technology, which is that foundation that basically brings together the people, the process, the technology that powers that content engine. The content factory is really the production arm, and it's where you'll see, we'll talk today about where quality governance sits, and we put it right there in the content factory. And then functional design and development is literally about, upskilling the organization, understanding what does a centralized content team or other way to set up content, how does that work in organizations? And the other interesting thing is, this has impact with what we're discussing today too, is that a centralized content team has to spend time training folks across the organization how to participate in the content lifecycle. And that's the tricky thing that can be culturally tricky, and this gets us right firmly into governance, right? Because you've got a lot of people who just think they know better, and they don't want to have to follow any rules, and that just doesn't work when you've got so much content going out there. We will typically talk to clients who will say, all right, well, how much content are you talking about? 800,000 pieces, 2 million pieces of content. So, how do you effectively keep track of that? So from here, what did I do with the clicker? There it is. Yeah. All right. So now this model, this is what we consider to be our Uber flagship model in our content strategy and ops service. And I'm showing it to you today just to, again, kind of set some boundaries of how we look at content. Now, what this model does is it basically shows you the life cycle, the ecosystem for content in an organization. It's focused around marketing, but really this applies across the board. And what this shows you is, look, there are 4 main buckets here, if you will. You have to have some kind of an insight about your market, your customers, in order to produce content creation. And then you have to activate it or distribute it in some way, and then you're going to try to make it better. So even if you're doing a really crappy job, you have to do those 4 things. Where we begin to embed some best practice is in the dark blue. Those are the stages that are connected in a workflow in producing content, right? And below that, in the green, are the key deliverables for each of those stages. And one of the things, I suddenly got very loud. One of the things that we talk about is the fact that for every stage, you need a deliverable. You need a milestone piece that gives people an opportunity to agree or disagree about the direction. And that's really important. So what we find is we will work with our clients specifically on what's your audience framework? Have you figured that out? What is your content strategy? Have you documented that? Are you using the same strategy every time? What are your brand guidelines, your content brief? So all of these things, having a moment in time where you document something is really key to, in particular, a life cycle that involves a ton of people, which is certainly the case here. So when we talk about this, another way that we look at it, and I don't expect you to read these boxes, so don't even worry about it. Really, just look at the top 2 rows. So this is that same model, and there's a reason why I'm showing you this today. We're introducing this scope of content and strategy and operations at Summit this week. It's a brand new model, and it has a purpose. So the idea here is to try to help our clients figure out, all right, if I have a content team focused on content, what should they be doing? How should I be scoping this across the content lifecycle? And what does it look like when we're just starting out? And what does it look like as we're moving up to better proficiency? So the reason we have built these in other services, and we find that our clients really like these because it gives them an opportunity to figure out and create a roadmap for their proficiency based on the needs of the organization and best practices. So each of what we call the capability stacks are underneath the 4 categories. So if you look under Content Factory, you see we have content process and quality governance. And quality governance, and by the way, you could break this into many more things, but part of the exercise here was to try to create logical buckets that can address proficiency needs. And we will actually create a tool based on this, an automated tool that clients can use to rate themselves and figure out their roadmap. If you look under quality governance, you can see the progression, if you will, starting with at the very bottom. And we find that many companies still just doesn't exist. There is no real governance. It's a free-for-all. It's the Wild West, right? And then in the early stages, brand guidelines, editorial guidelines are put together. And then editing oversight generally starts out as only being on some content, and then editorial oversight ends up being embedded in the overall workflow. And you can see as you move further up that stack, you get to formalized and actively monitored quality governance. So that's kind of a mouthful, but that gets at the way that we look at an advanced organization, the way that they're looking at governance. And the other thing we'll talk about as I take you through the steps we've put together is that governance is not about policing, it's about enabling, right? And that's one of the hardest things to get across culturally, but it can be done. We've seen it done. So I know it can be done. So you know what? Let me tell you a few other things about governance here, because I want to make sure that the full scope of governance and the way we think about it is clear as we move forward and I go through the steps with you. So as you look at the elements of governance along the left, these are pretty obvious. They're familiar to you. Some of them may not be, though, like frequency, visibility, SEO. There's a reason that we bucket these other elements into governance, so separate from, producing content that's on brand and using the right words and all of that, because it's really a bigger issue, and you can see some of the challenges we have here. The thing to think about is what happens when content isn't governed, right? And you have that Wild West. It means that you're taking the time to put content out there that does not actually support your brand. And that can cause a host of problems that we'll talk about. But the point here is that governance really envelops more than what we may have thought of governance a few years ago. There's a bigger story there about protecting brand value. Okay, so I'm going to get into some statistics. And again, this is from our brand new study, the State of B2B Content. We talked to just under 200 content leaders, or people whose jobs include content. So not every company has someone who is an official content leader. So globally, mostly in the US, you could see the mix of job roles here. And then in terms of revenue band for these companies, it's the full mix, large enterprise, medium, and even some smaller businesses. So these are the areas of responsibility. And this is interesting. You see that content activation, so 100% of the people who responded to this survey said that they handle content distribution, activation in some way. And then it's a mix in the other areas, creation, strategy and planning, and so on. So we were very happy with the mix of responses we got, and we got some really interesting data from this study. About 165. And we typically, we'll go through and make sure if somebody seems like they're answering questions in a way that makes no sense, we'll pull them out. Okay, so one of the first questions we asked people to self-select. Are you advanced in your content work, or are you a beginner? And this was super interesting right off the bat, because if you take a look here, guess what? Most organizations self-identified as not advanced, beginner or something else. The largest category was that 20% in content creation, which makes sense, right? Because again, if you're in an organization, no matter what, you're producing content, you just may not be doing a good job. It's hard to say. These other areas that really support effective content, much lower numbers. Those are pretty bad. And so you'll see as we break down the other data, we look at organizations who consider themselves beginner versus advanced. So let's look at the next one here. All right, how many people work from a documented content strategy? And keep in mind, that means that that strategy includes an indication of the purpose of the content, who is it for, what are the goals that it should meet, how is it going to be measured, right? And if you look across here, you see beginner is the light blue, advanced is the dark blue, and you can see heavy on the left for the dark, heavy on the light blue for the right. So the way this more or less sums up is about 60% of beginner organizations say that they pretty much don't use content strategy. It's a pretty big number, right? Whereas 83% of advanced organizations say they do. Right? We thought that was very interesting. That was actually a little higher than we thought, because in our day-to-day work with clients, we're surprised at how often they're like, yeah, well, it's, or someone will show me a strategy, and you know what it is? It's an Excel spreadsheet with a bill of materials. That's not a strategy, right? Strategy by bomb, we call it. Okay, next one, service level agreements. Does anyone here know if in content creation there are service level agreements in your organizations? One lonely two, maybe, no one's really sure. Yeah, three. Okay, so here's the reality. We talk about this as really being something that should be prioritized. It is not common today, But the problem is, you know, when we talk about governance, a lot of the reasons, and you saw the set of the Sly Solo Operator and all those folks I showed you who don't feel they have enough time to do the right thing, a lot of that can be traced back to the fact that there are no SLAs. So someone requests content or requests that content is finalized, and nobody wants to follow a process or give it enough time, and what ends up happening is content is completed, which clearly lacks governance, it clearly lacks the oversight it should have, but it has to get out there, so it goes. If you had SLAs in place, and by the way, SLAs must be bi-directional, so it's not only what a content team is producing and promising, it's what the folks who are, the upstream providers of information or input, the downstream users who are making the request, they have a part to play too. They've got reviews and they have to give you the right input and so on. But SLAs, we firmly believe, if you have them, they can really help drive good governance. So again, here you see, no, we don't have SLAs, very high in the beginner. The middle is interesting. We have them, but they're not enforced. And that is certainly pretty common. You can see, and let me just sum this up here. So 50% of beginner orgs say they don't, and 50% of advanced orgs say they do. It's kind of 50-50, but 33% of those advanced orgs say that they don't really adhere to them. So again, if they're not adhering to them, that probably means they need to be reset. They're not working as SLAs. But again, an important component in governance, and again, just seeing this information says to me, it's a lot of completely ungoverned content that's out there. Okay, top reasons content goes unused. You see we have both 2014 and 2018 on here. One of the things we talk about a lot in our content strategy and ops service is the fact that people have way too much content. And when we work with folks on a content audit, they typically will get rid of about 60%. It's a pretty darn big number, right? So then we've asked people to take a look at, all right, if content isn't working, why? What's wrong with it? And that's where this gets interesting. And you can see if you look across these, there's not a huge difference from 2014 to 2018. We've got these 6 different buckets. Let me just kind of sum it up for you, though. Okay, for beginner organizations, top 3 reasons: findability. People cannot simply get to what they need. They don't even know if it exists. Quality and relevance. Customizability. Can it be translated, localized? Can I package it up for use by a specific industry? Things like that. Let me talk about findability for a minute, because to me this is so fundamental. What we see is most organizations have this insane proliferation of repositories for content. In fact, something we found a client that did a while back, and now we recommend it to everybody, is to have a kind of a give us your guns day or give us your guns week. Everybody should turn in the content sitting on their laptops that they've been using and no one knows about, and we're not going to ask any questions. Just hand it over. Maybe other people can use this. So, I mean, content is everywhere, right? That in and of itself creates such a governance issue. So that means, no doubt, you've got multiple versions of the same thing, and all but one of those versions has, important errors in it, probably, right? So these numbers show a whole lot of room for growth. Same thing, really, with advanced organizations, right? That findability is right up there as a big issue. And the technology part of the content audit, where we try to work with organizations to figure out how can we get this down to a manageable number of repositories. It's not usually one, but a manageable number. We spend more time on that. And people, when we look at our clients and what they've accomplished, when they tell us that they have actually improved a number like that, that's a huge accomplishment. Just making sure that content can be found. Wow, could you guys hear me without that, though? I'm thinking, wow. No? Oh, well, yell at me then, for goodness sakes. All right, better? Yeah. It's that, yeah. perfect wedding room. Anyway, so the centralized content library, which in essence is that centralized repository. And this is interesting too. So you can see that 40% of beginners do not have that. And let's face it, if anybody's ever been at a startup, this is like the last thing on anyone's mind until things get a little more mature and then you realize you've created a monster, right? Happens all the time. And then just to sum this one up, so 60% of beginners say they don't have it. 68% of advanced say they do. Interestingly, though, there's still quite a bit of room there for any organization to work when it comes to centralizing content. You know, one of the problems here, too, and we, at our summit event this year, I think we have 120 MarTech vendors at the event. So it started out for the summit event a number of years ago as mostly a conference with sessions and kind of a small marketplace, has exploded because marketing technology has exploded. And the complexity, it's one of the things we talk to our clients about every day because so many of the MarTech vendors, even if they are in different categories, they say they do the same thing. Even when it comes to providing a content library, we will talk to clients who say, wait a minute, I went to this sales asset management vendor and they say they can manage all my content, that I don't need anything else. The content marketing software vendor says they can, and the digital asset management says they can. What the heck do I do? So there are some technology reasons why this stuff is hard. It's hard to figure out what to do. Okay. So let me move along here. Universal taxonomy. Does everyone knows what a taxonomy is in an organization? Yes? Okay, and anybody here responsible for the, beautiful, right, for the taxonomy? Do you still live in your parents' basement or anything, or no? Okay. I'm sorry. Oh, goodness gracious. I actually spoke to a guy who's a true taxonomy owner at an organization not too long ago. And during the course of the conversation, he managed to use the word thesauri like 6 times. Thesauri like 6 times. I thought, I have never even heard that word. Oh my goodness. Anyway, universal taxonomy, particularly given all this complexity, and that means, I mean, you know, in essence, this is your Dewey Decimal System for your content, right? And this has become something that's critical even in measurement because, just as an example, I worked for a company where we produced an ebook. It was used by every region, but only one region called it an ebook. In every other region, it was called something else. So guess what? Even if it was tagged in systems, when we went to try to pull metrics on measurement, that became complicated now because everybody calls it something else. So, I mean, taxonomy touches so many things. And when we work with our clients on audit, you know, that's the first order of business. Do you have an up-to-date taxonomy? Does someone own it? Does someone own maintenance? What happens when the company makes an acquisition? I mean, it's something that's a very critical part of holding everything together. So in terms of what does that actually look like, 20% of beginner orgs say that they have it or will in the next 12 months. And a much higher percentage of advanced, but still not really, it should be 100%. It really should. Now, it's certainly harder, you know, we'll often talk to companies who will say, well, we've got, you know, the Americas and EMEA using our taxonomy, but APAC's really tricky. And that makes sense, but it really is critical that a universal taxonomy is in place. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into some steps we put together. Oh, and you know what? I'm just going to grab something here. I'm going to talk about, steps that, there we go, that we put together to help organizations look at a way to address the governance issue and get a lot of cross-functional folks involved. The reason why I grabbed this is what I have included in here are some slides from our friends at Intel. So I actually met Intel at this conference last year, and they subsequently became a Sirius client, and I found what they were doing fascinating on the governance end. They were ahead of a lot of companies in this area. So interestingly enough, our our client from there is at Summit. But he gave me some of his slides, and there's some really interesting data on his slides that I want to share with you. So I am going to show those in a minute. I just want to have those stats out because I could not memorize them. They were too detailed. All right. So in terms of our, how do I manage to keep doing this? All right. No. Oh, it's because I left it right there. Yeah, I lose my keys a lot, in case you're wondering. All right, content governance. So what we find when we talk to content leaders who really have it together, they are embedding a process for governance, for maintaining and driving governance in their overall plan, except when they're not. And when they're not, what happens is there's a crisis. There's some kind of governance crisis. The wrong person or the right person sees the wrong brand, and everybody's in trouble. So suddenly it becomes an issue. We recommend strongly against waiting until there's a crisis, right? But this does happen sometimes. In terms of what this looks like, and this is just a set of simple steps. When we work with our clients to help them adopt a process, we always customize these things, but this is kind of a good starting point for steps for addressing governance at a higher level. And it starts with assembling a team, and that must be a cross-functional team. And as I walk you through these, you'll see why. And coming up with a charter. This is really important because if you try to take on literally all content in the organization at once, unless you're very small, you will fail, right? You've got to prioritize. In fact, it's one of the interesting things I found in the way that Intel addressed this problem. You have to kind of figure out what is the area of your greatest risk. That's really what it comes down to. So you establish a charter, and then you get into risks. So you assess what functional groups in the organization are producing what content, and what is the biggest area of risk, right? Very important. I have a client, in fact, she's our Program of the Year winner. She did a really interesting risk assessment. She's in a financial services business, and she literally did a 4x4 to say, okay, what content do we have that is the biggest risk to the brand if it goes out wrong? We have limited resources, but let's make darn sure that that's what our editors work on, and not on the damn data sheets that they spend all their time on, or whatever it was. So a risk assessment is really critical. And then there's the audit. So looking at the actual content to try to figure out what are the things that we're going to be looking for to govern. It's the kind of thing that you look for in putting together acrolinks. What is going to give you a score? What is the context you'll be looking at? And then also the technology, right? Which is its own sometimes monster of a process. But you do have to look at the technology where you author, store, and activate content and those integration points. And then ACT, which is simply documenting and sharing a plan and communicating that plan and getting other folks to participate and feel that the plan enables them, doesn't police them, but actually helps make their jobs easier by giving them an easy answer as to what to do, right? That's kind of what it's all about. In fact, our client from Intel, I'm trying to remember the full name of his team, but it was something along the lines of digital governance and enablement. And he added enablement when he realized that governance didn't carry, too good a feeling with it for lots of folks. So that was interesting. Excuse me, let me get into this. All right, so launching the initiative. This is where I want to mention specifically, because I know many of you are from outside of marketing. There are so many different teams that need to be involved here. In fact, HR is missing from this. Sometimes HR is appropriately on this list. You'll see in a moment that the way that I like to think about it is, if you want to figure out who are all the people who should be part of a governance effort, think about the way your main stakeholders participate in your brand. What is their journey through your brand? It's a nice, easy way to figure out what the relevant content is. So that's teams. How is it I keep doing this? Here we go. Components of content. And you see that this list has a few things in it you might not think of, like metadata, right? even things like SEO, you could argue would be on here. You're not going to get the results you want from search engine optimization if different teams are off, denoting completely different terms as important, right? You need to be aligned. It's another area of alignment. So certainly brand attributes, messaging, product names, all the stuff that you would expect, but there are some other components as well. And then program parameters. So this is an important one. Sometimes what we'll say to folks is, okay, you really want to look back at all 10 years of your content, is that there's an opportunity cost there and a point of diminishing returns, if you will. You know, pick a time frame and pick an area of content that's still relevant. Set everything else off to the side, at least in a first phase. So we will tell folks if they're adopting a new process, a new approach to governance, do it in phases. Okay, so assessing content integrity risk. And this again, like I was mentioning a moment ago, what is the brand experience with your content? What does that look like? So from marketing, and we'll use as an example, a potential buyer or an existing customer who continues to be a potential buyer, right? So they're looking at content on your website, there's social content, everyone's concerned about the mobile experience and so on. And then let's assume as they're moving through their journey with you, they get to the point where they're working with sales. There's all that sales communications, which is greatly increases the opportunity that something's going to go out incorrectly. Let's just face it, right? And you really have to think about not only, you know, the formal presentation that, you know, marketing is generally trying to help sales to produce and use the right version of, but even things like what's in their email, what do they say in their phone calls? And then as you're moving that potential prospect down, what about your purchase documents and that whole process? I've seen people get completely turned off because in the purchase process, what is in their purchase documentation about the product is completely different than what they were sold, right? Starting off the relationship on a bad foot. So even that is an example of, you know, governance gone awry, if you will. Okay, and then customer support. And, you know, every company nowadays has customer experience managers, right? This has become, you know, with the advent of the cloud, this has become the huge thing. We need a lot of customer support. And what that means is a lot of documentation that's going to customers one way or other. And that includes, you know, things like call centers and the new hot thing everyone's talking about, chatbots. How do you manage those bad boys? And there are companies like turning all their attention to using chatbots. And then really the ongoing customer success and also upselling and cross-selling customers and maintaining that consistency of message and so on. Very critical. So again, it's looking across the whole brand experience. So what happens when you do put that brand at risk? What could that impact look like? And these are just a few things here. Some of them I'm sure you've thought about, but you know, lost business may seem like a stretch, but it really isn't. You could think of some examples where there's a mess up big enough that the business is lost. And in particular, that's going to happen if there's confusion between the finalizing a deal and what information appears in those documents versus what was in marketing documents, right? Big deal. Certainly reduced upsell potential. How many folks here know, are you in an organization where account-based marketing is a big deal, where you're selling to existing customers? Pretty much, yeah, I mean, most of us are, even if you're not in marketing, I can tell you, probably your company's trying to do that. So messing up when it comes to the way that you communicate to your customers is a big deal. In fact, there's another service that we offer in customer experience, and this is one of their slides. I stole it over because it occurred to me that these 4 steps in the customer experience design framework, particularly as you get into triggers and interactions, what are the triggers and interactions that you have on an ongoing basis with existing customers? And it occurred to me, well, hold on, those all have content. One way or another, they're filled with content. And there are different functions across your organization responsible for serving those customers, right? And in fact, the way that they build this slide is that it's a waste of time to think about, you know, intricate mapping of the life cycle stages and what are their roles and needs if you don't understand the basics about what your interactions are going to look like with them. So again, I pulled this into here because I think it's a great example of where post-sale customer experience supported by content is a really critical thing to think about. And then next is auditing the content artifacts. So again, we're looking across all these different departments. And let's see how this builds. Okay, this was that same model I showed you earlier. And there's a reason why I'm using it again here. So if you look at all of these different asset types that may pop up, you'd think, okay, but gosh, aren't those all just, don't they all fall into activation? There's a reason why we built it like this. The problem is none of these things are done once, right? They're done, and then they're done again. They're used again 6 months later. Somebody forgets to update something. Every time you reuse something, even when it's a webcast, you incur risk to the brand if you don't do what you should to make sure it's up to date. So in fact, this is a constant cycle going on, and really, again, any content that you think of. And nowadays, too, everything we put out there lives out there forever, right? So what if you've got a video on YouTube that's still getting views that is the exact opposite of the message you're giving today? You know, maintaining that kind of oversight of the content that's already made its way outside your company is really important. Okay, technology. So we put this together to take a look at what are all the different technology areas that touch this content lifecycle. And once we put it together, we realized, okay, that's everything. It's pretty much everything in marketing, sales, product areas. And that makes sense, right? Because content is so central to what we do. But it also means that it's complex to figure out what do you need, what do you use to help you create a governance environment. So in terms of selecting an approach at a high level, and of course we're not going to, in this session, try to get into what are the specific steps you take to figure out your technology solution. But at a high level, basically there's 3 ways to look at this. If you are a company who has adopted a single platform, and I'll just use as an example Oracle Marketing Cloud, that in essence, you've been sold this and it supposedly can take care of everything. There is going to be functionality in there, you know, nothing like what Apperlinks does, but there is functionality in there that will help you get to some level of consistency that will help reduce the opportunity to mess up content, that will help support keeping content up to date, and that single version of the truth, which is really what we're always talking about. Now, chances are you need plugins and different applications to increase your functionality, but you've gone with this one solution. The next area is multiple platforms. So this is indeed where you're looking at maybe you've got a Contently for your content marketing, you're using Marketo for marketing automation. You've gone with best of breeds to cover big areas of capability. And again, you're going to want to make sure that there's APIs, there's native integrations, and so on. And you want to be able to think out a ways as to how any piece of technology is going to allow you to grow and add on, which brings us to the third approach, which is point solutions, right? So point solutions should be providing capabilities that aren't in other platforms. They must be things that can be easily integrated. And it could be used either for that single solution, you could plug in a point solution, or for those multiple best-of-breed platforms. In essence, you know, you're using one of those 3 approaches, and the question is, how much does that approach expand over time? So that's just a quick look at technology. And then at the end, in terms of assembling a plan, and this is just a quick look at, all right, well, if I had a complete plan for managing governance, what would be in it? Excuse me. And that's what's indicated here, and I think you'll get a copy of this presentation in case you're interested in this. Really what I've done is just indicate in each category what question is answered by the plan, right? And that's a useful thing. Again, we talk about documenting milestones so that people can actually agree. Make things knowable. Folks shouldn't be guessing. Now, having a great communications plan for the governance approach is really important because of the cross-functional nature of that governance plan. So sometimes we'll work with clients just on their communications around it. And again, it can be a cultural change for folks who are, probably rolling their eyes when they hear, oh, there's going to be some new governance processes they have to follow. So you have to change the culture, get people feeling like this is really about enabling them, not about policing them, right? Okay, just a few more minutes. I'm going to go over Intel's story. So Intel, back in 2015, they got a new CMO. CMO wanted an audit. Let's take a look at everything and see where it is we may have, too much, too little. And what they found was kind of a big mess. And these numbers are interesting when you really look at them. So the number of Intel.com pages, the number of microsites. And Scott showed me a few microsites that you would never know they were Intel. They looked like toy maker sites. It's just all over the map. Actually, I find most interesting the last one, which is that 85% of the digital content owners had no experience managing digital content. That's probably very typical, right? Maybe that won't be in another 20 years, let's hope not, but that's a problem. Okay, so what did they do? I like this because I think it aligns actually pretty well to the steps that we talked about. So the first thing, production controls, so to provide some strategic guidance. And then a whole strategy for governance and a way to scale and activate governance. Now, one of the things they did here, though, was they really prioritized what they looked at. And they looked at the ways that various technologies could support what they were doing. So the two that they pointed out to me that were most effective in dealing with their immediate priorities around governance were Proofpoint and Acrolinks. So with Proofpoint, this was all about social media. So one of the priorities that Intel, and you think about how many partners Intel has, right? This makes sense. They determined that overseeing social was going to be a priority when it came to governance. So they brought in Proofpoint, and 456 content authors are monitored through Proofpoint. They're publishing in 114 different social channels, creating 70,000 outbound posts and monitoring over 1 million inbound posts a year. So they got a lot of stuff running through Proofpoint. And it's proven very successful for them. Okay, and then Acrolinks pretty much looks at all their content, but even there, so this is interesting. The initial focus, customer support call centers, 112 customer support call centers. So they improved linguistic consistency, and that was across multiple regions, right? Which is, another thing we didn't really talk about, but localizing content, it's a free-for-all. Folks don't know what's going to end up being the case. So 120 web content authors get the benefit of content running through Acrolinks, and 80 email marketing authors, and also for all of their web content, content must receive a minimum content quality score before it's published. So I love this example because it's really specific and it shows how they prioritize. When you think of how big Intel is, you've got to do that. You've got to be able to prioritize what content are you going to be looking at first. Okay, so what about the impact? Look at how these numbers came down between 2015 and 2017 in terms of the number of sites and pages and so on, and significant ROI, significant ROI. And actually, and this is in our conversations with Scott, one of the things we like to talk about was this formalized company-wide collaboration. People really ended up supporting the effort and wanting to be part of it. So it's a great success story. In terms of their key takeaways, also very aligned to what we recommend. Identify and prioritize where you're going to focus your efforts. Embrace governance and present governance in a way so that others in the organization can embrace it. And activate with technology. At this point, there really isn't a good way to do this without technology. Yes, you can have editors and copywriters, and that does not mean that your governance challenge is addressed, right? It's really about technology. So action items from us along those same lines. Activating functionality you may have today. So take a look at what you have today, rationalize that against what capabilities are completely lacking and what do you need. Look at opportunities to cascade what's done in one area to other areas. Certainly evaluate new technologies with an eye toward integration. And scale over time to pull in more and more of the organization's content. And then outside of marketing, we just encourage other teams to make sure that they're willing to get on board, work on that cross-functional team to address governance. One of the things we often work with our clients on creating a content council with cross-functional members across the organization, and that will include tech docs, customer support, and so on. And governance should be one of the things on their monthly agenda, so to speak, right? And again, ensure that technology integrations and investments are rationalized, are aligned, are maintained. You don't want to have waste in this area. You want to make sure that you're supporting solid governance. So that's it. And I'm not sure what time it is. Is there time? If anyone has any questions, I am happy to answer questions. Any at all? Yes, ma'am. There we go.
Very much enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, good, thank you.
I'm wondering whether, if you don't have statistics, you have at least a hunch on how the industry got there. How did we get to a state where content got so neglected in a way, or doesn't play as big a role anymore as it maybe used to in the past?
You know what? I do kind of have an answer for that, and I think there are two reasons, each pushing at content from either end. So content is central to marketing, always has been. But when you think about it, how many marketing teams for a long period of time have had a function within it called content, director of content? That's still very new. And it's one of those things that no one owns and everyone owns. And I really think that's a big source of why it's been neglected. Because people don't want you to mess with their content, but they also don't want to be responsible for everything that goes along with maintaining it. And at the same time, we've seen this massive proliferation. One of the things we talk about is the fact that, I know some of you are maybe in B2C businesses, but even when we wear our B2B clothes every day and go out to work, we are consumers and we're used to the Amazon experience. We expect anybody who wants to sell to us to get us the right content, the right time, the right place, all that stuff. And everyone is scrambling to try to do that kind of personalization. So there's just way more content than teams have been set up to manage. So hopefully that begins to answer your question. But now I think everyone's trying to play catch up and get their arms around this whole thing. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
There's one coming.
First of all, thank you for a brilliant presentation. I'm curious about your clients accumulating content. Clearly, it's a problem. There's a tremendous amount of content being accumulated, have to make sense of it. So far, I think we've kind of understand the comment is fundamentally, the content is in English. I'm curious of your thoughts. How are companies, how high a priority is it for a multinational corporation to begin plowing through their content that is not a native language? And are they seeking linguistic homogeneity first as a first step before they can begin actually plowing through Internet of Things, big data, this deluge of content that's coming in daily?
You know, unfortunately, I think folks are jumping into dealing with the deluge and getting it translated and localized without a master plan, right? But we are seeing this as a bigger and bigger issue. In fact, at our European summit last year, we introduced an approach to localization that takes into account, there's a lot of dependency here on organizational structure as to whether or not localization should be done centrally or whether it's done in country, and also depending on what are the goals of outside the main headquarters. Let's say China. What are China's goals with what audiences? Because that also impacts how localization is handled. If they've got a completely different audience, but they want to use some of the same content, then of course it's going to, not only is it going to be translated, it's got to be modified. So there's a number, the first thing you have to do is figure out what model are you going to use organizationally in terms of the way that you look at localization requirements. One interesting thing, a client that I'm working with, it's actually another one of our Program of the Year winners from NetApp, which of course is, international. So they had their web pages completely translated in many, many different languages. It was a constant drudgery effort of translating everything. And once they did an audit, they determined that a huge percentage of that was completely wasted. That in fact, folks from those countries were going to the main English NetApp page. And there was this assumption that things had to be translated, and it was an incorrect assumption. And you wonder too, with overall globalization and the flatness of the world, how often might that, do you really, how many languages do you have to, well, of course there's French, but then there's everything else, right? How many languages do you have to translate into? So an audit and an understanding of what the goals are is really critical. But this is something I will tell you, so we, within our service, we work on a 2-year research agenda. And this is one of the big areas we need to develop more research in because it's a big problem.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else? Sir, please.
There.
Oh, microphone.
This way.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit about customer centricity in the governance process and its relationships to content design and design thinking and how it plays into the entire cultural circle of what you were presenting?
Wow. Okay, so I'm actually working on updating our content strategy approach. And one of the reasons for that is I have felt that we need to go deeper when it comes to customer centricity. And again, this kind of comes back to that whole Amazon thinking. The expectations on the part of the B2B buyer are potentially completely out of line of what we're capable of in B2B. The technology to do amazing things is out there, but most B2B organizations are not quite ready to adopt some of the more sophisticated technologies. But what you can do is get a better understanding of your audience needs before you go off and just, do strategy by bomb. Well, we did an ebook last year, let's update that ebook. Got to have a white paper, let's do that. So one of the things we work hard on with our clients, and it tends to be really hard for folks, but we say, look, do not move forward on planning content until you understand what are the interaction preferences of your audience. Where do they want to see you, and when in their buyer cycle do they want to see you? You must understand those interaction preferences, and you must understand their asset preferences. don't just assume because you think an ebook is cool or an infographic that everybody does, right? So doing the homework that's needed, whether that is collecting data, that's certainly the best way to do it, to look at what does the data show in terms of interaction and asset preferences. A lot of people don't have that. And then we, suggest using some other methods of, getting to customers, getting to top sales reps to figure it out. The other piece is knowledge requirements. And this is a really tough one we find for people to work on, because we'll say, all right, we need to sit down and work through exactly what are the knowledge requirements of a prospect or customer that you're trying to sell to for each stage of their buyer journey. And we'll have clients say, oh, well, in the first stage, I'm going to tell them why they should do it the way we do it. And in the second stage, I'm going to tell them why, they should do it with us. And we say, no, forget you altogether, no vendor. What are their knowledge requirements to make a purchase in this area, period? You have to be able to provide content that responds to those knowledge requirements, whether it's you or someone else. And then obviously you're going to build your message into that. So what we also talk about is the fact that any single piece of content should have a combination of what we call information artifacts and messaging. And what we often see, one of the problems with content, is that people will do either or. So in other words, their thought leadership will be information artifacts. It'll be, here's our take on what's happening in the industry. We're real smart. We're going to tell you what's happening in the industry. This is a piece of information. And then they're not going to present their messaging until later on in the buyer journey. We contend that no matter when it is, your content should include both. It has to show and speak to your audience about what's going on in the industry, in the marketplace, among their customers, whatever the landscape is, as well as your message. And as for the weighting of each, of course that changes, but both should be there. And you know what? Governance does apply here, because one of the things that will get away from people is the way that they talk about an industry. You'll find out that your folks working on content are a couple years behind what the sales guys say is actually going on with customers, right? So there's a lot that goes into that, and we do find that people are very quick to just sort of skip over and say, well, we got to have these 5 things for content, end of story. Really? Does it meet those requirements? So I hope that answers your question. Okay, well, thank you so much, folks, and thanks to Andrew and Chris and the Acrolinks guys.